Okay, welcome everyone. We got Ned Shultz is going to try to share a screen for us today. Okay, Ned, give it a try.
Okay, all right. Frank, I guess you got to show me where it is. I don't see it here.
Yeah, down at the bottom, you should have a green box that says share screen.
Right in the middle.
Looks like you found it.
Yep. You know what, Frank? I thought you had it, so I didn't need to pull it up. I can pull mine up real fast.
I mean, I have mine up already, but go ahead. We're not going to a wedding, so we got time.
Okay, you got that?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, slideshow, start from the beginning. Okay,
Great.
that's in Korean in case you want the whole spiel in Korean, but I'll try it in English today. But I don't know if you can see this book. Somehow it doesn't come up. Anyway, there's a book called Koryeo 2B, Essentials of Korean History. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I was reminded I had promised to do a translation of this particular section of the Koryeo. There's the Koryeo and the Koryeo, and this is sort of the essentials of Koryeo history. And I was tasked with doing the first 50 years or so of the Mongols when they came into Korea. And I wish I could really show you this book because it's really a neat cover. When my there it is. When my granddaughter saw that, she said, "Oh, Far, Barbie pink." And so if you need a reason to buy a book, it's in the Barbie pink. Little did we know that the Koryeo Kingdom was going to be so far ahead of everybody and choose the right color for a book. But anyway, this is essentially roughly a 50-year part of Koryeo history. And what's intriguing is, for those of you who recall, the Mongols were always looked upon as being a horrible time for Korea when they came in and took over and dominated Korea, and it was just a terrible time. So after I translated this section of this book, I said, well, what does this mean? History is not just a compilation of facts, it's also interpretation. And so I decided, let me sit down and think about this, since I spent 6 months translating it, and figure out what did it actually mean. And the result is what I'm going to talk to you about very briefly today. But just to do a real quick history, since I'm sure you're fully interested in what happened in the Koryeo Kingdom. Koryeo basically 918 to 1392, between Shilla and Chosun, just to give you sort of a sense. And in the middle of the Koryeo Kingdom, the military came in and took over. And the head of the Korean military was a guy by the name of Che, and he controlled, and there was a thing called the Che House. And by the way, if you really want to read up on this, I wrote a book that got an award from the Insomniacs International. It's probably the best sleeper gout in Korean history, but that talks about that whole period. But essentially, this Che dictatorship was overthrown in 1252.
That's Ned.
And after that, Koryeo then surrenders to the Mongols. And this is after the Mongols started invading in roughly 1230. So, and for over 55 years, Koryeo put up with this ongoing invasion. And finally, in 1260, they said, okay, enough. This is ridiculous. We're beating our heads and nobody's getting ahead of anywhere. And just at that time, the first king I'm going to look at, a guy by the name of Wonjung, comes to power. And he rules for basically, or he reigns for basically 15 years. And then his son follows for 34 years. And then his grandson follows for 5 years. And so what I'm trying to do is I look at this particular period is look at the question, how did Koryeo adapt or just survive? Did they accommodate? Did they grovel? Did they just survive? Because now after over 30 years of fighting the Mongols, they finally had to surrender. And what did they do? And as I was thinking about this, the Mongols begin a so-called occupation. And then I was thinking about other occupations Korea suffered through. And of course, the Japanese occupation comes to mind first and foremost, roughly 1910 to 1945. And then, of course, we're looking at the today, the Russian onslaught against Ukraine. And are there similarities? Are there lessons to be learned? And so just the whole thing of looking at that. And before I go there totally, I want to go back just to the title. It could have been living under the Mongols. It could have been any number of things, but I decided to say it's living with the Mongols as opposed to being dominated totally by the Mongols. And as I said, I think I mentioned how this whole period is looked upon as a dark age in Koryeo history, when it was taken over and dominated by the Mongols. And so with that in the background, I am trying to give a slightly different point of view and raise these questions. How did Koryeo adapt? Did they accommodate, or did they just survive? And then, of course, thinking about Russia's onslaught, and I guess you could also bring it into right now with the whole battle between Hamas and Israel. How does society survive? How do they accommodate? And just to give you a picture, this is sort of the Mongol kingdom. It's called the Yuan dynasty at its peak. And you can see that Koryeo is on the far eastern flank, and you go all the way to the west, and so you sort of get a sense of the vastness of their empire, of their control, at sort of the peak of their roughly around 1350 or so. And again, just to remind you, they come into Koryeo, and Koryeo surrenders in 1260. So that's just a quick picture of what the Yuan dynasty looked like. Now, it starts with Wonjung, and he's the first king. He actually had lived under military control by the military kingdom, military generals who controlled it. And when his father died, his reign started. But this poor guy becomes king, but he has to deal with three overlords. The first was this guy by the name of Kim In-jun, and he came to power when he assassinated the last leader of the Che house. And so he basically was the military strongman through the first 8 years or so of Wonjung's reign. And then Kim In-jun ultimately was assassinated and removed by this guy Im-yun. And he was the second military strongman who tried to dominate the kingdom. So the kingdom initially has to deal with these two military chiefs. Im-yun essentially died in 1270 under pressure. And the other overlord is the Mongol emperor, because the Mongol emperor also was very much involved in trying to control Korea. And in fact, the Mongol emperor helps out the king Wonjung by the fact that he did not like either Kim In-jun or Kim Im-yun, and helped the king basically get rid of these two military overlords. Now, when Wonjung surrendered, he had promised to return the capital to Gaesong. For those of you who really can remember history, during the first part of the Mongol invasions, the court picked up and moved to Kangwa Island. And for roughly 30 or 40 years, it held out on Kangwa Island and fought against the Mongol onslaught. And the Mongols said, if you return the capital, if you leave Kangwa Island and return to the capital, we will remove our troops. And so they promised, okay. And so the Mongols started to remove their troops even before 1270. And so once 1270 came and the two military overlords were out of power, the king kept his promise and started to move from Kangwa to Gaesong, and also disbanded the major military powers. And they're called the three elite patrols. And for those of you who are well versed in Korean history, the Sambyulcho. And he calls for them to be disbanded. And no sooner does he call for their disbandment than they rebel. And some of you might recall from our time in Hilo, when they gave us a great insight into Koryeo history, this three elite patrol rebellion went on for roughly 3 years. And it took a great deal of pressure from both the Mongols and the Koryeo kingdom to suppress them. They moved south to Jindo, they moved south to Jeju, and finally they're done away with. And so the king not only has to deal with these other overlords, he also has to try to suppress the 3 elite patrols. At the same time, Mongols are demanding that Koryeo invade Japan. You probably all recall sometime in our history that the Mongols wanted to conquer the world, the whole world, not just Koryeo, but they also wanted the Koreans to move in and invade Japan. And so tremendous pressure is put upon Wonjong to start building for this invasion. In the middle of all this, this is the final problem this poor guy has to confront. There's a major revolt up around the western capital, or the Pyongyang region. And basically, a guy by the name of Che Dan revolts and basically surrenders to the Mongols and takes the whole northwestern section out of Koryeo control. And here the king also is trying to figure out how to stymie this revolt. So poor Wonjong did not have an easy time about it. And the other thing that Wonjong has to do is his ties with the emperor Kublai. He was, as you recall, the third strongman, the third power that the king had to deal with. And part of the problem with Kublai is he was the emperor of the Mongols, and he's constantly making demands on Koryeo. I want you to send me this. I need more troops. I want you to send me eunuchs. I want you to send me gold. I want you to send me falcons. I want you to send me women. And Koryeo, the king, continually says, hey, we're poor. We just fought you guys for 35 years. We don't have any resources. We can't possibly do this. And so this was sort of the ongoing debate between the emperor and the king. And the king always pleaded poverty. And ultimately, the emperor said, okay, we'll let you continue. And he also wanted the Koreans to start to wear Mongol clothes and take up Mongol customs. But again, the Koryeo king, especially Wonjong, said, hey, we're Koreans. We have our own customs. We have our own traditions. And so he allows them to do their Korean thing. He also withdraws his troops, as I think I said, from the Koryeo, which again shows that he was listening to Koryeo's response. And in some respects, the Mongols actually helped Wonjong become a better ruler. He aids the throne. When Im Yun, he was the second dictator, tried to force Wonjong to abdicate, the Mongols came in and said, what's going on here? Im Yun, you better come to the Mongol court. And at that point, Im Yun dies. So anyway, the Mongols are helping Wonjong maintain his throne. And I mentioned the revolt of the Sambyalcho, the 3 patrol elites. Again, the Mongols sent in their own troops and helped the Koryeo king suppress this rebellion. So these are ways in which the Mongols maybe are dominating, but maybe not, and how the Koryeo people are actually living with the Mongols and getting the Mongols to support them. Finally, the emperor allows the Wonjong's son, the future King Chungnyeol, to marry a Mongol princess. And this actually ends up being really important in terms of Koryeo strength, Koryeo ability to deal with the Mongols. And so these are things that Wonjong Wonjong deals with. By the way, we often wonder what Kublai looks like. I'm sure that picture doesn't help us get a better understanding, but that's somebody's vision of what this guy. He's also known as Kublai. I spelled him initially Q, so you could choose however you want to Romanize it. When we did this translation, the hardest thing is there's a lot of Mongols mentioned in here, and how to Romanize Mongol names. And we just decided we're going to use Korean as our source to Romanize these Mongol names. So Wonjong, just to recap, he grew up in perhaps one of the most challenging periods of Korea's history. Right at the beginning of when the Mongols have come in, right at the end of the military dictatorship. And for 2/3 of his reign, he had to struggle against military strongmen. And he stood up to the Mongol elite in defense of Koryeo governance, Koryeo culture. And for example, as I said, he refused to wear Mongol clothing. And you really have to credit him with keeping the Koryeo kingdom alive. He accommodated many Mongol wishes, but he preserved a Korean identity. And so you may want to call this a dark age, but certainly this guy was there struggling to try to maintain a sense of Korean identity, which to me, I was pleasantly surprised to discover. Now his son comes in and he brings Koryeo fully into the Mongol orbit. It's under his rule that the ties between the Mongol ruling family, the Koryeo ruling family really become very, very much closer. But he too had issues to deal with. One issue was he married a Mongol princess. And he had the problem of how do I deal with this woman who is the one of the members of the Mongol imperial household, who obviously has her own personality and her own sense of what has to be done. So that's one of the first things that he has to deal with. The second major issue is the invasions of Japan, because right after he becomes king, the invasion of Japan starts. And for those of you who've read Wind and Waves or read any number of histories, this was a really traumatic event in which tens of thousands of Koryeo people were put on ships that were built by Koryeo, and they go to Japan. And what happens when they reach Japan, Bobby? Bobby, what happens?
Kamikaze.
they're the kamikaze, the divine wind comes in and destroys the fleet, and so the Japanese feel vindicated and they stop the invasion.
Fine wind.
But then there's a second invasion that will come about 5 or 6 years later, and again the same thing happens. So he has to deal with these major invasions and the attacks that are put on the Koryeo people, not only supplying ships, people, provisions. The third issue that really confronts Chungnyo is tensions with his son. He does not get along with his son at all, and the son does not get along with him at all. And it causes a lot of trouble. In fact, in the middle of his reign, he finally gets fed up and says, okay, junior boy, take over. And junior boy, his son, takes over for 8 months and is a total disaster. And so he's pulled back to the Mongols. That's the kind of tension that Chungnyo has to deal with. So how do you assess this poor king who has these problems? And the guy has many, many personal problems. But the biggest problems are dealing with his wife, the princess, and his son. Chungnyo was 39 when he ends up marrying the princess. And so for roughly 20 or so years, he was the crown prince. And of course, if you think poor Harry or Charles or any of these other crown princes had problems, this guy had all these women thrown at him, and he actually liked women a lot. And so suddenly his wife comes in and discovers all these women who have this fancy to the king, and she has to really assert herself, and that causes a lot of friction between the two. And as I say, there were also problems with his son. And so what does a good king do when he can't deal with his court, when he can't deal with his wife? He goes off hunting. He becomes a very, very avid hunter and spends lots of his time hunting. He also ends up becoming a party man. He ends up enjoying wine, and occasionally he'd like to enjoy women, but his wife is there watching over him, keeping him under control. So he had a lot of problems, but he did defend Koryeo institutions. He did defend the sense of a Koryeo identity. For example, the Mongols came in and they didn't like Koryeo's slave law, and they tried to change the idea of slavery in Korea and wanted to do away with it. And Korea resisted. They said, no, this is Korean family law. If you try to do away with slaves and the right to slaves, we'll suddenly have these low-class people moving into power, and we can't allow that to happen. And so even they cite the earliest sources of the Koryeo kingdom. And so basically they stand up to this idea of changing, of doing away with slavery, and continue to assert the need for slaves in Koryeo. Another proposal the Mongols came in. Mongols had many wives, and in Koryeo, men were only allowed to have one wife, men of power, men of stature. And the Mongols, said, well, listen, we do this. Why can't you guys also do that? And actually, the court began to discuss it, and some of the ranking civil officials said, yeah, maybe we should don't take many wives, until the wives heard of this policy and said, no, this will not occur. And so again, the idea of multiple wives in the Koryeo kingdom ended, and they did not accept the Mongol tradition. They also allowed the Koreans to continue to dress in their own Korean clothing, although ironically, Chungnyeol, the king, chose to dress as a Mongol. He had lived with the Mongols when his father was king. He had gone over and spent a lot of time there, and I guess he kind of liked Mongol clothing. And he also accepted the Mongol style of hair. Mongols had a slightly different hairstyle than the Koryeo people. So that's something which he did, but the Koreans were allowed to generally dress as they wished and continue to wear. They didn't have to take on a Mongol hairstyle. He also gained control over the Northwest. Remember, I talked about this guy Che Tan, and he ultimately ends up agreeing to surrendering his territory over the Northwest. And so Chungnyeol is able to reestablish the basic unity to the kingdom. Some people look upon Chungnyeol as a warrior king also because he does help the Mongols when the Mongols have invasions and problems within their own family, and there are several rebellions. Chungnyeol agrees to go forward and help the Mongols suppress their own rebellions. So during this period under Chungnyeol, we do see missions go back and forth. We do see tribute go back and forth between the two countries. The whole relationship between generals and civilians becomes very normalized. We also see a lot of administrative reform going on, and the examinations continue to play a major role in recruitment. So in many respects, there's a sort of return to the normal Koryeo way of life at this particular time. So how do we assess Chungnyeol as a king? And in many respects, I look upon him as sort of an unfortunate guy. He really was tired of his royal responsibilities. He didn't really like being a king. And he looked for ways to avoid the responsibilities. And of course, one way, as I mentioned before, he just was an endless hunter. He loved to go off on these excursions of hunting. And he loved his women. And after his wife died, somewhat 21 years or 24 years into his reign, he then was able to once again go back into having lots and lots of parties. And according to the Koryeo sources, he had parties almost every other day. And he invited women to come in, of course, and help him party. We also see him traveling a lot around Gaesong. And he liked to go to hot springs, and he visited temples on occasion. And so we really get a picture of a king who just didn't want to be king. Now, Koryeo survives in part because the strong civil traditions that Koryeo had already developed. And this is a theme that I actually developed earlier during the military rule, in explaining one reason the military became as successful as they were was because they relied heavily upon the civil traditions, the government examination passers. And they really continued to help support and carry on the whole idea of Koryeo civil traditions. But I think it's also important to understand that the Mongols, the Koryeo also survived because they were supported by the Mongols. The Mongols really needed Koryeo to exist as a kingdom. I essentially looked upon the Yuan as they needed a flank to support the heartland. They needed Koryeo off in that far eastern corner to sort of keep things calm on their borders. And for those of you who are Chosun dynasty specialists, when the Manchus come in and take over Korea in the 17th century, they also came in and tried to get Koryeo support and serve and have Koryeo serve as a protective flank before they go in and conquer China. And so the Yuan basically was doing that as well. The Mongols were doing that as well because they needed Koryeo as a secure flank. So during Chungnyeol's reign, Koryeo certainly didn't flourish, but it did survive. And you may want to call it dark, but in many respects, it wasn't as dim as traditional historians have liked to draw the picture. And that leads us to Junior Boy, the last king. And he is the son of a Mongol princess. And so he's half Yuan, half Mongol. And as a kid, he spent lots of time in the Yuan, in the Mongol capital, what we call the Yuan dynasty. And he really grew up enjoying what was going on in the Yuan period. And in his rule, we see both women and men playing a very, very important part in his own governance. He loved women and he loved men, both maybe equally. I'm not sure. The dynasty, the Chosen historians who wrote the Koryeo were a little appalled by some of his behavior. So you get a fairly negative picture of this guy's 5-year rule. But what's interesting, at the start of his dynasty, his kingdom, the first year or so, he looked really promising. And he tried to bring in a number of different reforms. For example, for those of you who are familiar with Chinese history, there's the ever normal granary in which the kingdom brings in lots of grains, rice, and whatnot, and stores it and holds it until there's an emergency, and then they can release it to bring about stability. And so this guy Chungsun sets up this particular set of ever normal granaries as a protection against future drought or future famine. He also brings about the regulation of salt. Salt is an extremely important part of the Korean diet, anybody's diet, and to control its production, to control its distribution was extremely important. And so he tries to regularize that. He also ended the office of breeding falcons. One of the things that the Mongols loved were the falcons of Koryeo. And it caused all sorts of corruption, all sorts of issues, and it just became a huge problem confronting the dynasty. And so he says, let's do away with it. And so they end that office and basically stop the whole idea of breeding, having special offices to breed falcons, because it just caused too much corruption and too much pain. He though, despite these initial starts, after 1 year, he wants to abdicate. And he was about ready to abdicate. And people said, hey, no, king, continue. But he was really a disturbed guy. He takes on 2 queens. I mean, most of us are satisfied with 1 queen, but no, sorry. He takes on 2. And then for some a peak, he executes his crown prince. And so I'm very disturbed. And it's during his rule that he brings in lots of eunuchs. And he has the eunuchs really come in and try to exercise control. And finally, after 5 years in power, and 4 of those 5 years are spent in the Mongol kingdom, Mongol capital, he finally abdicates to his son and says, okay, I'm out of here. And there's a large consensus on the part of everybody, especially some of the Korean leaders, and especially the Mongol emperor. Yeah, you really need to abdicate. And so he does end after 5 years. And to me, he's an example of what happens when the throne is passed to the wrong person. It's kind of a sad period for him. And thank God it was only 5 years. So that real quickly, the 50 plus years of the first of dealing with the Mongols. And so what
Ned,
is all
Ned,
pardon? Yes.
Yeah, is it okay to ask a question?
Sure.
You said he had 2 queens. Was one of them a Mongol princess?
No, his first wife was a Mongol, and she and he did not get along at all. And after she had been in Korea for a year, she sends a letter back to the emperor saying, get me out of here. And so she goes back to the Yuan dynasty, and he says, well, she's not here. I'll have 2 more queens. And they even tried to get divorced, but then he abdicated, and I guess she stayed a princess in residence in the Yuan kingdom.
So who was the crown prince that he executed? The son of one of the
that was one of his earlier he had a number of women. And
Okay.
before he became king, it was one of the women from there, and he was the oldest of his sons, and so that one was executed. And then the second one, who became the crown prince, was from another Korean woman. And so
And he had no sons with the Mongol
right.
queen. Okay. Thanks.
And that does cause a problem, but it does allow another person to come in who has a Mongol princess's son to move in and become powerful. Because one way to rule, one way to govern, is to have a Mongol wife with a half Mongol son.
Yeah, but he was
Good
half
question.
Mongol. His mother was
Pardon?
Mongol. His mother was Mongol.
His mother was Mongol. Yeah, yeah, I know. And that in a way, he because of that, when he was a crown prince, he spent a lot of time in the Yuan capital and was very friendly with the emperor. And I mean, he had full run of the palace from what we could see. He would go into the emperor's bedroom and chit chat and do everything. But when he became king, he initially, as I say, came on with great ideas, but he just, I can't take this. So what we do see, though, is Koryeo survives during this time, and it did seek some autonomy, and it did defend internal traditions. So it really isn't Koryeo under the Mongols; it's Koryeo with the Mongols, the Koryeo never really groveled. If you read some of the histories that were written, say, during when the Japanese came in and took over and were trying to show Koryeo as being hopelessly ungovernable, you don't really see that. He did have to accommodate Mongol demands. He did have to agree to the invasion of Japan, although he sought to stymie it. But he had to accommodate to survive. And what's interesting is Koryeo largely rebuilt itself in the first 30 years. The Mongol invasion ended in 1260, and really by 1290, after the last of the invasions of Japan, Koryeo was becoming once again a fairly productive society. And as I say, it really rebuilt itself. And in part, the kings did become sons-in-law, or generally sons-in-law of the Mongol emperors, but it had its advantages. And it's also important to realize that the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols, needed Koryeo as a secure flank. They looked upon Koryeo as a source of wealth, a source of resources. And they were constantly asking, hey, can't you send us some more gold? Can you send us more resources? They looked upon and wanted Koryeo eunuchs. They also wanted Koryeo women. And later on in the dynasty, there is a Koryeo woman who becomes a Mongol empress towards the end of it, and ends up bringing her family great resources and whatnot. They also, of course, as I mentioned, looked to Koryeo for falcons. Falcons, of course, were great in, I guess you would know about falcons, Sharon, being in Colorado, but they're a great resource for hunting as well. And so essentially, Koryeo gave them a certain prestige value. And again, this is the idea of the Yuan kingdom covering the known world, from the eastern flank of Koryeo to the western steppes lands. And so it benefited Yuan. And it also, of course, as we look at it, it brought Korea closer into the Sinitic world. It brought Koryeo closer ties with what was happening in China, what was happening in the capitals. And right now, it just happened to be the capital was dominated by the Yuan, but it's very much also becoming increasingly a Chinese capital. And new ideas begin to come in and become more productive. And for those of you who study Neo-Confucianism, Neo-Confucian ideas become a much more prominent part of Koryeo intellectual life during this particular time, in part because scholars, courtiers are going back and forth, back and forth. If you look at the king and the courtiers, in some respects, it's a pretty sad story, but it's really a story of endurance. And it's a story of endurance in part because, I credit the basic civil official, the administration that kept on working even under this Mongol control. But it's also, we don't often credit the peasants, but they continued to work and struggle under this heavy state. And just to reflect, this particular book, the history book that I translated, doesn't talk about this side of the Koryeo kingdom that's producing at this very time this exquisite pottery like the Celadon. And in the middle of this period of the Japanese invasions, the Samguk is being written and published. And so that's the other side to the story. And so maybe from some people's point of view, it's a dark age, but it's also, let me get out of there. It's also a period in which you can't help but think about other societies that have had to deal with invasion and how do they endure. And particularly, of course, I was thinking when I was writing this, because the Russian invasion of Ukraine was and still is ongoing. But what does this tell us about the Ukrainians? Should they give up or should they continue to fight? Well, of course, you and I, most of us think they should better continue to fight. But the huge cost it is to a kingdom just to do that. Anyway, that's just sort of what I wanted to say in a nutshell. And I did try to speak quickly. So if you have questions, you need further clarification, I'm happy to do it. But and by the way, this last page, I had to give a talk last week in Korea and on this whole subject. And I used the Koryeo Jelyo right there, that second volume. And that's what this book is. And there's also another history that was written about the same time called the Koryeo. And so really you have to use both. But I was just trying to do a comparison between these two. And this is for Koryeo historians. And if any of you become a Koryeo historian, let me know and I'll explain what this is all about. But let me go back to the beginning and see if you have any questions.
I think you can stop the slide unless you're the share, unless you're going to be using it.
Nope.
Okay.
Well, that way we can see everybody. Very good.
Right.
Very good.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Okay, I see your name first. What's your name?
The question was
Sharon.
they didn't Sharon. They didn't want to have multiple wives, but they still allowed concubines.
They allowed extracurricular activities, yes, especially though in the royal family. This was more geared towards ministers of state and lesser officials. The king did have several women, but by and large, no, for the average civil official, average general. Which is quite interesting because in the Chosun period, it does become much more common.
Ned?
Yeah.
To your last point about the peasantry and the Koryeo enduring largely in the peasantry, I'm curious about that. Were the Mongols attempting in any significant way to change the structure of the society, the way they went about their daily business, the way they were governed? You mentioned that the local government stayed pretty much the same, I think. So were there any changes, any indications that life changed in any significant way for most people in Koryeo?
Yeah, for the 90%. Another good question. You guys always ask great questions. They did make some initial attempts. For example, the allowing to do away with slavery. And if that had gone into effect, it would have changed the whole structure of local society. But the Koryeo people said, no, we're leaving that in place. The peasants did suffer because who are the ones who have to produce the goods to send off? Who are the ones who have to go off and do the fighting? And so in that respect, they do suffer. But once the battles are over, the Koryeo does everything to try to revive the peasantry and to sort of reestablish the traditional order. To them, that was the whole tax structure was in part built on keeping a strong administrative system. So that's why they endure in part. And that's, to me, it's just something we often, as historians, we overlook. We're so busy looking at the top tier.
So are you saying in effect that life for most people didn't change very much in terms of their everyday life?
Yeah, once the invasions were over, once things settled down, yeah, I think for them, the 90% at the bottom, more or less continued. Buddhism continues to come in. It isn't really abbreviated at all by the Mongols, and the life does, from what I can see, continue. David.
Ned, what were the languages, the primary languages of interaction during those 55 years?
They used Chinese, and this book is all written, of course, in the classical Chinese. But we do see the kings trying to build up an office of translation, and so the court is trying to have Mongol speakers, and the kings, because they ended up living so much in the Yuan dynasty, they also were learning the Mongol language. And so at the very, very top, there's an attempt to use Mongol and speak Mongol. But down below, it's more or less stays with the Koryeo, whatever that was.
Thank you.
Yeah. Interesting question, though. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but there is a clear example of Wenjung trying to show what a good king he was when he does start an office of translation, and he does bring in men who can become adept in the Mongol language, and they go back and forth. There's a lot of Mongols who come in to help the princesses when the princesses come to power. She has a whole group of Mongol people who come in and act sort of as her inner court, and they of course don't bother to learn Korean. It's sort of they feel it's incumbent upon translators to help them move around.
How many of the kings spoke Mongolian or Mongol?
The first king, Wenjung, did not.
Right.
The second one, Chungyol, because he had spent time in the Yuan court, did, and his son, who was half Mongol, did, and from then on, you have almost all kings speaking Mongol. And many of them actually liked living in the Yuan capital more than living in Gaesong. And in a way, I kind of feel sorry for the first princess, because I mean, here she had grown up as a part of the imperial family in the Yuan capital, and suddenly she's sent off to Gaesong, some hick town, I guess, from her perspective, although we all think it was beautiful. And she had to live with this guy who had all these former love affairs, and she becomes immensely jealous, and ultimately she dies fairly young into the marriage. But she's really comes across from the histories as a vindictive woman, but you got to look at it from what she was suffering too. So to me, what was intriguing was I went into this whole period thinking, oh God, what a horrible time in Koryeo. And in some respects, it was horrible because they'd just been taken over. But then they quickly accommodated themselves, and the Mongols turned out to be not as bad as a lot of people thought they were going to be. And they continually adjusted to it. And it made me think about, well, the United States came in and occupied Korea for 3 years, and Japan obviously occupied Korea, South Korea that is, occupied Korea for over 35 years, 40 years if you go by my count. And looking at the two, how did the Koreans accommodate? I think the Koreans ultimately did better under the Mongols than they did under the Japanese, but that's just my bias. And I don't know. It's a hot question, but we still live with the horror of the Japanese occupation, and the Koreans still live with the horror of the Mongol occupation. But I'm trying to say, well, it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as you think it is. Just like the American occupation was bad, but as bad as you think it was.
Was slavery restored after the Mongols left, or did that?
Well, it was
would
never done
that be-
away with. They never did away with it. It was maintained throughout the Koryeo period.
Okay,
The
So-
Mongols tried to do away with it, and they said no.
but they didn't succeed.
Yeah.
So, was there any lasting effect of the Mongol period on Koryeo at all?
Good. I think it's been used throughout history as an example of what happens when a foreign power comes in and tries to take over. Remember, they fought these guys for 35 years, and you know, they moved their capital offshore, and they found any number of ways to fight against them. The Koreans really, I think, developed a strong sense of being a separate people, and then finally say, okay, all right, this is stupid. We're not gonna, we just gotta end this. And so I think that legacy of fighting, the idea of standing up to the foreigner, is an important part of Koryeo history, and that's why they not much. Koreans don't spend a lot of time looking at this Mongol interregnum, however they want to call it, and they tend to pass it over pretty quickly, and so I guess it takes a foreigner to look at what a foreigner does to a country during this period.
Ned, I'm interested in what you say about the slavery. Was there a slave class then?
Very definitely, yeah. Yeah, it starts well before, and in fact, at the beginning of the court, well, goes from Shilla. There was slavery in Shilla, and there was also slavery at the beginning of Koryeo. And in fact, people who were during the wars of unification, those on the losing side were often put in and made slaves. And then that whole class continues right up through the Koryeo kingdom. And it actually continues into the Chosun period. The thing is, a slave is a slave, but the American experience with slavery is in some respects quite different, because ours also took on a very strong racial division, whereas in Koryeo and in Chosun, the slaves were basically of Korean ancestry. They just were stuck on the wrong side, but it does continue up through. Well, some people say even today you can find people in aristocratic families. Yeah. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I think Charlie can probably talk about it. He probably might have seen some of it in the village, but the Pekjung are people who often perform still considered vile things like being butchers and whatnot. And they often were products of this so-called slave class that continues. So yeah, it's very much a part of the Koryeo kingdom. And the Mongols, as they tried to do away with it, but they thought it was unnatural, but the Koryeo said, no, this is part of our society.
My landlord of the house where I lived in that village, he was an ongijangi, which means a maker of pottery. And he came from many generations of that, and he was looked down upon because that is, you know, it's not slaves, but it's low caste.
Yeah.
You know, as you say, butchers, tanners, people who deal with meat, death, and ongijangi go in there too for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why, but his family was a family of ongijangi.
Yeah, exactly. And people tell me, like I had a friend who was really friendly with this kid who was Pekjung, and his parents said, you really shouldn't bother with him, keep away. Or that whole idea of Koreans not being brown skinned, try to be as white as possible, because those who are dark, those who are tanned, are considered products of this lower class. So it's all these subtle things that I'm sure Tan can tell Bob about possible Pekjung and how you have to stay clear of them. Right, Tan? So hopefully you have a better idea of this period that I think has been largely misread in Korean history. And think about it, there are times when there's good lessons to learn. So the Koreans did learn some things during the Mongol rule, just like the Koreans got a few things out of Japanese rule. But I think both periods would have liked to have been under Koryeo or Chosen monarchy, Chosen leadership under outside leadership.
We have time for one more question, I think. Anyone have a final
Okay,
question?
I have to very quickly change, put on a necktie, and vanish.
Yeah, turn off the camera before you initiate that.
I,
please.
love
I
the way you
definitely will.
teach, Ned. I love your storytelling way of teaching.
Yes.
Yeah, let's thank Ned. Thank you, Ned.
Thanks, Ned.
Yeah, there's Mike Devine. He can give you
Mike
a
Devine is here. Hi, Mike.
Okay. Hey,
Welcome.
thanks a lot, guys. I'm sorry I can't stay for any more conversation, but I gotta go. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being patient.
Thanks, Ned.